So in today's video, we're going to discuss getting data from websites. And what I mean specifically is when you go to a website like YouTube, Facebook, any Mang, Fang, or whatever they call it nowadays type companies, or just any normal website in general, there is a lot of data that you can extract from those websites. If you go to a website periodically or daily to, let's say, get some sort of information that you need to see visually, or you need to copy and paste something from a website, and you do this in a repetitive nature in any way, shape, or form, then I think this video will be for you, because we're going to be going into how to be able to extract that data in a programmable sense using different tools or scripting languages. Now, if you've never done something like this before, but you want to understand kind of how to go through getting the data that you need on a website programmably, then I would say just stick around with watching this video and take note of specific things that I may mention and look them up so that you can use those concepts, because we're going to talk about these different concepts of being able to extract data, and I'm going to go from like the easiest to probably kind of more of the hardest. I don't view it as hard now, but it's a little bit to configure and set up. And if you're just trying to grab data, you probably want to go with the easiest routes first before going through what I'm about to explain later down the road. So the first way that I usually try to extract data from a website, a web server, or some sort of service in general is by using an API, or just using what the developers will give you. Now, an API that a developer gives you from that website or service that you want to try to get data from is usually the first method. And there are for so many reasons that you want to go for an API that the developer is giving you first. Now, if you're not necessarily sure about how to use that or anything, that's totally fine. In particular, there are numerous different ways, from graphical ways to writing it with programming or scripting languages, to be able to use APIs, at least web APIs. And an API is just an application programming interface. It was made decades ago as far as the concept, and it doesn't actually have to do anything with websites or web servers at all. It's really just a contract between, I would say, two developers, one who actually makes the API, the other who actually wants to use the API. If I wanted to build out something for, let's say, a website that I had, and I wanted other developers or other people who know code in particular, or programming or scripting or anything, who want to be able to, let's say, consume or use some of the data that is from the website in a programmable sense, then I would probably give out this kind of contractual understanding as to a way for them to be able to access that data, and that is what an API is. And what's cool about an API is that it's agnostic. You could use basically any modern language to be able to consume and use a web API. So on most computers nowadays, there's something that you could use without programming called curl. You could use that, it's at the command line, and it allows you to be able to work with HTTP methods to be able to then make a request to, let's say, a website or a server. You could use Postman, you could use Python. There are so many different ways to be able to work with web APIs. And what's cool about this agreement is that the developer will most of the time give you documentation on how to use the API. And so that's extremely helpful, because now you know how to be able to use the API based on whatever methods it's using, let's say with HTTP, with REST, or GraphQL, or whatever it's going to show you. You can at least use these methods on whatever language you want or whatever tool you want to then be able to access the data you need. Another cool thing about this is that this is supported. You can then complain to the company about something working or not working in particular. Another great thing about it is that the information that you are given is usually constant. The website URL and like kind of the URL directories or routes or whatever you want to call it, those things are usually constant. They may have a version change where you may see like version 1, version 2, but they are usually constant. And so that is extremely helpful, because if you're building out, let's say, an application or an automated service or a script that kind of works around an API, you want things to kind of be static. If you're depending on someone else for your data to come in constantly at all times expected. So let's say the data isn't available from, an API that the developer's offering you. Then what would you do? Well, the next thing that I would do, depending on the situation, is actually work with the HTTP method or direct call of what I need directly. Now, this is where it kind of is going to get a little bit more, not technical, but I would say a little bit harder, right? You see, the first one was about getting APIs. That's cool. But if we really take out the concept of the APIs and really focus on how you're retrieving the data, that actually comes from HTTP methods or a REST method. Most of the time, it depends on what type of API you're consuming. But if this is the case, then this means that if the developer is not offering it to you, but you see it on a website and there's no security things involved and you know that it's there, then the next thing that you would want to do is go into your network traffic, see if you can find that route or data that you're looking for in particular, and see if you can replay it. Most of the time you can right click on the actual, let's say, line or thing that you found in your network traffic and then copy the fetch request. This would be some sort of JavaScript that you can then go into the console of Google Chrome or whatever browser you got, and then be able to paste that back and replay that. One thing I would add to that is to add a little bit to the end of the fetch call to therefore convert the response into a JSON response, so that therefore you can be able to actually see the information out and see if whether or not the actual call was successful or not. And a lot of times what I've seen is that those calls will usually be successful. Knowing that means that if you are able to replay it in the browser, then you are able to replay it most likely in other places, although be it with caveats. The URL itself could change. There's a lot that could change. The data itself could change. There could be an issue where you're getting a 500 because the way you're kind of modifying your request to be able to get a lot of data back may not work properly, and the developers were never intending for you to use this like that. That is the biggest point. So if you're going to use this method, understand that it comes with huge risks. And now we've talked about pulling data from using HTTP methods. We've talked about APIs that developers give you. But what if all of that isn't there? Like, what if I just don't see it in the network traffic from, let's say, an API call? Now, I do see it in the network traffic, but I only see it in the HTML itself. If the data is actually rendered on the HTML, this means that the data was most likely server-side rendered, meaning that the data was most likely, built out and generated on the back end of the route of whatever web server that's being dealt with, and then it's placed into the HTML so that by the time you get the information, it's fully rendered directly. And if that's the case, you're not going to see that information through an API call. So if that is the case, the only way that you're going to get that information is through web scraping. Now, web scraping is basically the second method of what I would do. It's extremely powerful, but when it comes to efficiency, it's a lot less, right? Like, a direct API call is better because you're getting just the data you need. Usually, a lot of times, it's a little bit faster than having to render out a bunch of information that you don't need just to get to the data you need. And so again, getting an API from the developer would be better, and then also trying to see if you can get the direct API call or the direct HTTP method call in the network traffic. But if we're going to go ahead and do this method, that means that this is the only method. It's not slow, but it's just not as efficient as doing the other two methods. So you can use something like Beautiful Soup for Python, which is an HTML parser, right, along with the request module. So if you have those two things in combo, you can basically download out the HTML content web page that you would have normally seen, then use Beautiful Soup to therefore parse the information down to exactly what you need, and then go from there and do whatever programmable stuff that you want to do. Now, again, one of the caveats would be for this is that if the HTML on the page changes a lot, then obviously the way you parse that information needs to account for that if you're trying to do this in a programmable sense, right? Like, that's what's going to make it worth it, because if not, you could just go to the web page yourself and copy and paste if you need to be doing it every single day because the web page changes. But there are certain parts of a web page that may not change. So you having to go through reading the HTML content is going to be a little bit more of configuration to understand if this web page that you're even looking at is even parsable, like going down in the future. Now, the first three methods usually cover most scenarios, but there are two more concepts that are done just in case for very specific and hard scenarios that you have to deal with. Let's say you're on a website where you see the data on the page. When you go to the network traffic, you see the data in the network traffic. But then when you try to use something, let's say like curl, Postman, or Python's request module, or C#'s HTTP client, right? Like anything normal, and you try to do the same thing, it doesn't give you the exact same data that you were expecting back, like you normally saw in the network traffic and you normally saw on the web page itself. When that happens, there is another concept that I use that I call a hybrid parser. There are probably other different things for this word, but it's kind of, I would say, the stepping stone to the final thing that I'm going to get to. Most of the time, what's going on is that there is JavaScript that is on the page that is ran immediately when the page normally starts, that is most likely calling out and doing some sort of check or call that basically will finish out the rest of the chain of events to be able to actually then finish out the actual network call for the data that you're seeing. So on your side, you probably just see that the network traffic works and it pulls your information. However, in reality, if you look at the chain of information in the JavaScript, you could see that it's doing a bunch of other things to be able to get you that actual network traffic. So you just trying to call that HTTP route won't work. You're going to need an environment that can run JavaScript. There are different tools where you can basically run JavaScript in a very small environment, and so that you can just load what you need for just the web page to basically load as if it was on a normal web page, but then be able to do the same commands that you need to pull in the data like as if you were doing a direct HTTP call. The first hybrid parser of what I think about is Python's request HTML package. You can download it from pip and add it to your project. And essentially this comes with Puppeteer in the backend. And so that when you're like traversing through, let's say, web pages using HTTP methods, you can basically essentially keep your session, and it will load the JavaScript calls in the background so that therefore the data of what you actually need actually comes in. And this works really well, but there's just one caveat that is pretty difficult to deal with. What if you have to log into a website? Like, what if the information of what you have is locked behind something that you're allowed to log into from a website, but they don't give you any other way to be able to get that information and you desperately want it in an automated way? There are a lot of different authentication schemes and a lot of different ways that developers and companies do things to be able to kind of prevent this automated method of logging in. Like they may have cross-site forgery tokens, they may have JavaScript added in for validation checks, and although the hybrid parser can deal with that, there may be more complicated things that make it so that may not be possible. I think like there are some other things where, for example, you may have like a cryptographic GIF added in somewhere where that's being validated in particular. So there may just be more things that are complicated. And if you know how to be able to break against those, then yes, you could do the other methods that are given, because the other methods that are given are not just first because they're easy, they're also first because they're efficient. You won't need to have something very big and bulky to be able to get the data you need. And if you're talking about something as far as like milliseconds to seconds, as far as how fast you get the data, the other methods that I talked about are usually first because you're going to get that data faster than this. However, again, if you can't log into the website or server or whatever you're trying to get to, you know, in a programmable sense at all, then you're probably going to need this last resort. And that is Webdrivers. A Webdriver is a programmable automated way of being able to work with a browser. Most browsers have a Webdriver, and it's been that way for years and years and years now. They essentially come out at the same time that a new version or a release of a browser comes out. For Chrome, you're most likely going to get a Chromium Webdriver, And for Firefox, you're going to get, I believe, what's called the Gecko WebDriver. With having a WebDriver, you can use something like Selenium or Puppeteer or whatever to be able to then manipulate that actual WebDriver against your browser that you have installed, right? So for me, if I'm trying to automate something where I've tried all the other steps, what I'm going to do is, one, make sure I have a browser on the computer, right? Chrome, Firefox, or whatever. Two, get the actual WebDriver for it, right? So download the WebDriver, make sure that that's there. And then three, get a way to be able to use that WebDriver. And for this discussion, I'm going to talk about Selenium. Selenium is basically an SDK to work with a WebDriver. I could be wrong on that, but that's how I see it. Like, I use it on Python, but you can use Selenium with basically almost any other scripting or programming language of nowadays. And so you would use that, you would basically then call out your URL of whatever you want. And then from there, you can basically do the same things that you could do with HTTP calls, but using Selenium. What's crazy about Selenium is that because it's a WebDriver, you can be able to manipulate the things that are on the screen with keyboard strokes or mouse clicks or whatever else you need. So this makes it so that if, let's say, the browser needed to detect that movement was on the screen or for whatever reason, you can make that happen with Selenium. One cool thing about this is that with the headless mode, it makes it so that now you can essentially run this from anywhere, because all you need are those things that I was saying before: a browser, a driver, and Selenium. And you can do that on Linux. You can get yourself a cloud Linux instance right now, or spin up something in Docker right now, get all those things installed, and you don't need to have it graphical. You can set it in headless mode, which will allow you to be able to get the things that you need to in a programmable sense while still doing the clicks and keystrokes that you would normally do. Besides one of those crazy captchas that are super annoying, I don't think that there's any other thing that could basically stop Selenium from getting the data that you need. So I hope you learned something great. I hope you're able to get the data that you want from this. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to be able to discuss with you guys and learn something myself. And if you like the video, please leave a thumbs up and please subscribe if you would like to see more content like this. Other than that, I hope the rest of your day goes well. Peace, everyone.